there. And the police came and got him, and the ambulance came and got him. And then the events from the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday of the service, of the eulogy, of the 2 receptions when people came to the house, I decided to chronicle everything that was going on during those 4 days and then wrap it up a year later. As you know, the book started with a title, Letter to My Son the Weekend He Died. But we decided it really was more than just a letter. And so that's why we changed it to 4 days and a year later. Anyway, the whole point was, how do you get through a weekend like that?
Mm-hmm.
And then what do you do once the weekend is over? And then what do you do once you look back on that weekend? And then looking at that weekend, you look back at the rest of your life with him, without him, and all the things you could have done differently, should have done differently. Not that any of those things that you would have or could have done differently would be better, but all the other choices in life you could have made.
How much time passed between when it happened and when you finally sat down to write about it?
I started writing pretty quickly. I would say within a week I started writing it. I started writing in a week because I didn't want to forget those moments. I actually write in the book about how I would be driving down the street and literally find an old bank envelope or receipt from a bill and just write down a moment, a memory I had, so I would not forget this moment about him. Because once you start writing about your children, you could write forever. You couldn't write everything down. But in my mind, how could I write this story without mentioning, for instance, the Curious George pajamas he once had on when he was 2? And so I wanted to get that down, and I wanted to get the moment on I-70 between Manhattan, Kansas, and Columbia, Missouri, when we spent a week eating nothing but junior bacon cheeseburgers from Wendy's. So you drive down the street, literally I drive down the street, go, cheeseburgers.
Mm-hmm.
I have to find a pen and a piece of paper to write down cheeseburger. That's literally how the research I did on the book. And I love that quote about how if you're writing by yourself or you have a deadline of once a week or once a year, why do you need researchers? Well, I was my own researcher.
So this is not your first book, but the previous ones have been essentially humor. You are a professional stand-up comic, have been for years, decades. Wow, I'm making you sound old now, but the point is, this is what you do. And this book is a far cry from that. Was that a hard transition to make?
It's a hard transition to make if I want to sell these books after a show, which I've been doing with the other 2. Yeah.
Right.
It was a hard transition to make, but in some ways it was actually pretty easy. That cliched line between drama and comedy came in pretty clearly to me. I mean, you've read the book. Mm-hmm. You know, in the middle of all this with my son, my father flies in from Las Vegas, and he's worried about a cell phone. He just can't program his cell phone. So he's asking everybody to help him set up the voicemail. Me, his daughter, my ex-wife. And it was hysterical to me, hilarious to me, that he did not quite get the enormity of the moment. But then you realize that's the thing about grieving. Everybody does it differently, and some don't do it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then you realize how close the drama and comedy is in our life, even during the worst of times.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I remember the morning after Paul died, I really felt like I was going to have a heart attack. I mean, it felt like you can't die the same weekend as your son. Nobody would do that, right? Nobody would have a heart attack the same day as your son. So I found that. So I found some humor in that, some life in that. And there was life everywhere I looked that weekend. There was a reason to go on living, if you will, that weekend. Trying to get all that into this book, though.
Sure. Tell me a little bit about your writing process. I suspect some people listening to this are thinking, well, something that horrible happens, the book writes itself. But I know that's a far cry from the truth because I've read several drafts of it and I know you've read more. So talk a little about that.
Well, the book writes itself. It just doesn't write a really good book. It's when the book writes itself.
It's probably true of all books that wrote themselves.
Yes, that is really a great question, Bill, because at some point, no matter how invested you are in the book, no matter how much it means to you, no matter how much people's lives are at stake or their memories are at stake, you have to come to a point in the writing of it where it is now a book. And you have to think of it like a book. And it's got to have structure, and it's got to have a meaning. It's got to have a through line. And it can't just have your autobiographical ramblings. There has to be a structure of a book. And so what I write, and I would think every word of this is anointed and cannot be touched. And the first draft back from you'd like, well, what is this first part here? We don't need that. We don't need that. You can't have this 400 pages. This has to go. Nobody's going to buy this. And you need people to look at your book as a work of art or a product that other people would have to buy. Otherwise, if you're not going to look at your book as something that other people would want to read, then just write it and put it under your bed as a diary. But once you send it out to the public, you have to think of this book more objectively. And that's why you need good editors around who can look at you and say, look at this and say, I don't want to step on the memory of your son, but we can't have, 100 pages on your memories of him as a toddler, because everybody has memories of children as a toddler. How does this move the story along? How does this move people along who might be interested in it? Mm-hmm. So the process, to answer your question, is I would write in spurts. I would not sit down every day and do it, but when I'd write in spurts, those spurts would sometimes last a couple of hours. I would usually put some music on, his music that he would like, or music that just made me think about those relationships.
I was going to say, Joan Didion, who I know is a writer you admire, has famously written about the year of magical thinking, which in part I think was sort of getting past magical thinking and getting back to reality. I thought I saw some of that in your book too, but maybe I imagined it. Is that there? Or?
No, let's hope that's there. In fact, the great moment over the weekend when I found out that my book was 96th on Amazon and her book was 97th. Right. That was the sweetest moment ever for my writing career.
Bosom buddies, and in the top 100. So
in the top 100, yeah. Although her book's been out, how many years and sold how many millions of copies, and I've sold 8. But whatever, we're 96 and 97.
Right.
But yeah, you do want to get through it, but you don't want to get through it too fast. I think you want to spend your time getting through that magical moment, and then you get on with your life. But you remember that the moment now has changed you, and I think the book, if it's successful, will kind of show how it changes a person. How it changed me, in this case, from where I was before that Friday to where I am afterwards.
Another thing I think it has in common with, we'll stick with Joan Didion since we're talking about her, but a lot of good. I mean, this is a difficult subject, challenging, but not really a hard book to read, in part because I think it's written so well and so beautifully. The prose itself is... Many times you find yourself, this is just gorgeous to be able to mine this kind of prose out of tragedy like this. That's really kind of amazing.
Well, thank you. Since we're talking about writing and memoirs, the way to do that is to remember that everybody has these emotions, these ups and downs. Everybody's had somebody die on them. Everybody's had somebody disappoint them. Everybody knows a drug addict. And so for a book like this to work, I think you've got to stick with the specifics. Mm-hmm. And if you just stay with the narrative and not feel the need to tell readers what the narrative means, they get it. If somebody comes in with your son in an urn and hands you the urn and you put it in your lap, right, and you're holding the urn, talk about that moment when someone hands you the urn and you sit there, what it feels like on your leg and what it feels like with your arms around it. You don't have to go into I was so sad. Oh, this was so depressing. People will get that. Let them see the narrative.
I think that takes an enormous amount of bravery, though. I've never had anything like this happen. I wrote a poem once about a cat I lost. I love that cat.
I read that poem.
I can't read it aloud at a poetry. I can't get through it.
You can't talk about it now. Look at you.
That's right. I start getting flustered and embarrassed. And I think what you're doing in this book is astounding. Just amazing to me.
Well, thanks again.
Enormous bravery. In the nonfiction world, books like this, sometimes people talk about the takeaway. I don't know if that's because we're like the self-help generation, and I don't really necessarily think that's why people read nonfiction, but you hear that. So if somebody, pushed you up against a wall and said, what's the takeaway here? What would you say?
Well, okay, I've thought about this because I know that's going to be a question I get, and I have figured out a takeaway. You know about the Oprah moment I heard?
No.
That some agent said, where's your Oprah moment? I said, what's an Oprah moment? He said, it's the takeaway. How do people get through this? I said, you're kidding me. You want an Oprah moment for that? And I didn't have one. But here's the takeaway. Since I have to have one, I don't want one, but if I have to have one, it is this. The takeaway is you get through these things because you realize there are other people in your life who need you and need your love. And the best way to get through the death of someone in your life is to love the other people in your life stronger. That's how you keep the love, the memory of the deceased alive. That's the only takeaway I've got. You just love forward. Please don't put that on a card anywhere. That sounds terrible, but you do love forward and love stronger and throw your shoulders back. That's how you honor people you love.
That's wonderful. Barry, thanks for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you, Bill.
Barry, you are an inspiration, and thank you again for being on the podcast. Remember, December 17 is the release date for my new novel, Trial by Blood, the third book in the Daniel Pike series. So please check that out. And then, if you have any money left over, take a look at Barry Friedman's beautiful memoir, 4 Days and a Year Later. Until next time, keep writing. And remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit.